What is going on, Solo fam? My name is John Solo, and today's subject of discussion is not for the faint of heart. In honor of Halloween, the holiday that smells like old rubber and gives children cavities, the holiday where we dress up and celebrate all the things that scare us, here on Messed Up Origins, we're going to celebrate America's first ever ghost story, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. The short story, following the flighty school teacher Ichabod Crane and his confrontation with the Headless Horseman, was written and published in 1820 by Washington Irving, and since then, it's become a household name for families across the country. In addition to the popularity of his story, which like many of the tales we talk about was part of a collection, the Walt Disney Company also did their fair share of spreading the story far and wide with their short film of the same name. At the request of the Solo fam, we're going to explore the dark origins of this already frightening story. Before we get started, make sure you smash that like button with all your heart. Get seasonal with it, pretend it's a pumpkin. And if you haven't yet, why don't you subscribe and ring that bell while you're at it? By doing so, you can set up alerts to go straight to your phone whenever there's a new Messed Up Origin in your sub box. And now that I'm done with the shameless self-promotion, I say it's time we break down the Disney story for anyone who needs a refresher. Fellas and females, without further ado, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. The movie opens in October of 1790. Ichabod Crane, a lanky, gluttonous, and very superstitious schoolteacher, moves into Sleepy Hollow, New York to work at the schoolhouse. The small town is infamous for its ghostly hauntings and spectral sightings, so you know someone as jumpy as Ichabod is gonna have a bad time. Despite his odd behavior and appearing as the total opposite of a ladies' man, the new teacher doesn't take long to form good relationships with the women of Sleepy Hollow and his students. One of these women is the stunning and incredibly wealthy Katrina Van Tassel, whose heart Crane finds himself competing for against the most manly man of all time, Ron Swanson. Brom Bones. Unlike the usual love triangle, there's really no good guy here. Brom is kind of a womanizer, and Ichabod's mostly interested in Katrina's father's money and land. Fast forward a few days to Halloween night. The Van Tassels throw a party, and both Crane and Bones spend the majority of their time competing over who gets to dance with Katrina. After Brom's attempts at sabotage backfire, he tries a new strategy. He knows that Ichabod loves scary stories, is superstitious, and is also a coward, which is kind of a masochistic personality when you think about it. It reminds me of how every woman in my life watches Law and Order and Criminal Minds late at night and then thinks every stranger that doesn't smile at them on the street is gonna kill them in a dark alley and harvest their organs. Here's an idea: if it makes you that paranoid, maybe it's not good for you to watch. Or in Ichabod's case, not good to read. Well, Brom capitalizes on this chink in the school teacher's armor. He tells the whole party the story of the Headless Horseman, a soldier who lost his head to a cannonball in a battle not so long ago, and every Halloween he rides through the area looking for a head to replace the one he lost. After the party ends, Ichabod stays behind to make a move on Katrina, and while we don't know the specifics, he was ultimately rejected and went on his way home with a broken heart. On his journey back home, he finds himself pursued by the terrifying Headless Horseman, who appears to be very real. Crane remembers something that Brom said earlier: if you cross the old bridge over the brook, the horseman will disappear in a flash of fire and brimstone. Only it turns out that's not true. When Ichabod makes it to the other side, he looks behind him to make sure he's safe, and he's met with a flaming pumpkin right to the face. Sometime later, we see Katrina marrying Brom and learn that Crane's disappearance has become a legend in Sleepy Hollow. While most residents presume him dead or spirited away, rumors persist that he simply cut his losses, moved out of the area, and began a new life with a wealthy widow and lived happily ever after. You might not know this, but Disney's adaptation of Irving's story was pretty accurate. They found new ways of showing character traits, like Ichabod being superstitious and Brom Bones being the supreme competitor for Katrina's heart, but when it comes to the story's events, they're pretty similar. The biggest difference is Irving's version gives us quite a bit more detail about what makes Sleepy Hollow so spooky, and it doesn't try to bring any levity to the story or make us laugh. The differences are slight, but they are there, and believe it or not, the Headless Horseman's legacy goes back way farther than just 1820. He has a rich history that can be traced back hundreds of years across multiple countries. With a past that is so complicated, I thought I could use some help breaking it down. So I want you guys to give a warm Solo fam welcome to our first messed up guest, my friend and fellow Disney fanatic, Isaac from WotsoVideos.
Hello Solo fam, I'm Isaac from WotsoVideos, where we discuss fun topics for fun people. I'm all about spreading the magic of Disney, which is why I'm so excited today to be able to discuss Sleepy Hollow with John. As you said earlier, John, Irving's Legend of Sleepy Hollow was America's first official ghost story, but he wasn't the first to come up with the Headless Horseman concept. In 1798, at the age of 15, he moved from New York City to the village of Tarrytown to escape the city's 10th outbreak of yellow fever. ever. Moving from the big city to a smaller village out in the country was exciting for Irving. He enjoyed the tranquility of the country as well as the spooky atmosphere that seemed to fall on the town every night. It's in Tarrytown that many historians believe Irving first heard the story of the Headless Horseman, and that his move is what ultimately inspired his novel about Ichabod Crane, the newcomer who arrives in Sleepy Hollow totally oblivious about what madness he was getting himself into. The novel opens by introducing us to the eerie setting its events take place in. The way Irving describes Sleepy Hollow is as much of a character as anyone else in the story. The play still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the descendants of the original settlers. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subject to trances and visions, and frequently hear music and voices in the air. The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Sounds terrifying, right? At least the real estate is probably pretty cheap. No one knows exactly why Sleepy Hollow is like this. Some say it was bewitched during the early days of the Dutch settlement, and others claim a Native American chief held his powwows there before the land was discovered by Henry Hudson. The most famous ghost in the town of Sleepy Hollow was the Headless Horseman, who was said to be a Hessian soldier that had his head knocked off by a cannonball during the Revolutionary War. His body was buried in the graveyard of the local church, and every once in a while the specter can be seen riding his black horse to the scene of the battle in the eternal search for his head. Our story follows Ichabod Crane, the new teacher at the local schoolhouse. He, like every other character in this story, matches his animated counterpart to a T, both in physical appearance and personality. The book does put emphasis on the fact that he's an excellent school teacher. He was stern, but also caring, and would even walk some of his smaller students home at the end of the day to make sure they got there safely. Well, that, and he was trying to finesse his way into some food and a place to stay. Apparently his role as a teacher didn't pay very well, and he was one of those skinny guys who could put down an entire Thanksgiving meal if he needed to. So in exchange for food and lodging, he'd also work on his students' families' farms, and before long, he became a well-known face around the town. But it wasn't long before he found himself in the midst of a battle for Katrina Van Tassel's heart.
Now, unlike the movie where Crane just stumbles upon Katrina walking down the street and gets lost in her eyes, in the story he's the neighborhood singing master and gives out lessons. Katrina Van Tassel was one of his private clients, and it only took one visit for him to realize that she was the woman for him, because it was on that first visit he saw her massive house and sprawling farmland. This girl was beautiful and had money, and Ichabod couldn't help but fantasize about what those riches could bring him, so he was determined to catch. But we can't forget about Abraham Van Brunt, aka Brom Bones. He was broad-shouldered with short curly black hair and a bluff but not unpleasant countenance, having a mingled air of fun and arrogance. He was famed for great skill in horsemanship, and he was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, but had more mischief and good humor than ill will in his composition. Brom was also trying to steal Katrina's heart, and while she wasn't always the most receptive to his advances, she didn't outright reject him either. It wasn't until Ichabod entered the picture that Bones got really competitive. At first, he wanted to beat up the school teacher, but similar to the movie, he was just too crafty and always got away. Also similar to the movie, Bones played all kinds of pranks on Crane. He taught a stray dog to make the most annoying, whiny howl and would take him near the Van Tassel farm to disrupt Katrina's singing lessons, and on more than one occasion, he even vandalized the schoolhouse. I mean, how could Katrina not be attracted to that? Now let's skip ahead to the Van Tassel Halloween party, because that's where stuff really goes down. After arriving and seeing the place all decorated for the festivities, the immense amount of food, and everyone having a good time, Ichabod couldn't help but fantasize about a future where he was the lord of it all. He spends the evening stuffing his face and dancing with Katrina, while Brom Bones is wallowing in the corner feeling sorry for himself like I used to do at dances in junior high. Later on in the evening, Ichabod overheard some older folks reminiscing about the good old days and telling ghost stories like the residents of Sleepy Hollow were known to do. One mention was made of the woman in white who haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock and was often heard to shriek on winter nights before a storm, having perished there in the snow. But the majority of the stories were focused on the Headless Horseman and the residents' experiences with him. This includes Brom Bones, who at this point had figured out Ichabod's weakness, just like the cartoon. He tells the superstitious school teacher about the time he raced the Headless Horseman for a bowl of punch and should have won. But just as they came to the church bridge, the Hessian soldier bolted forward and vanished in a flash of fire. Eventually, the attendees made their way out of the party, but again, like the movie, Ichabod stayed behind to have a chat with Katrina, thinking he was on the high road to success with her after that night. But it turns out that wasn't the case. We don't know exactly what happened between them, but we do know that Crane left in a sour mood. The book's narrator proposes that she was just encouraging poor Ichabod to make Brom Bones jealous. At first you want to feel bad for him, but then you remember he was mostly in it for the money anyways, and your tears dry up real quick.
So you guys remember how in the movie Ichabod's horse would not cooperate with him no matter how hard he tried? Well, the book sheds some light on why this is. The animal was a broken down plow horse that had outlived almost everything but his viciousness. He was gaunt and shaggy with a ewe neck and a head like a hammer. His rusty mane and tail were tangled and knotted with burrs. One eye lost its pupil and was glaring and spectral, but the other had the gleam of a genuine devil. In his day, he must have had fire and metal, if we may judge from the name he bore of Gunpowder. So not exactly the best horse to be riding when you're being chased by a headless ghost that wants to kill you. As the night grew darker, Ichabod couldn't help but feel more and more alone, and the ghost stories he heard that night slowly crept into his mind. In fact, he was approaching the very same area those stories had taken place. Suddenly, Gunpowder stops dead in his tracks. There's a large shadowy figure standing in the middle of the bridge up ahead. Crane asks the figure who it is, but he received no answer. Then, when he started whistling one of his psalms, a trick he used to calm himself down, the figure swiftly rode up to him. The night was so dark at this point, Ichabod couldn't make out who the stranger was, but it seemed like no matter how fast or slow the school teacher went, the mysterious rider would always match his pace and rode on the blind side of Gunpowder. Then, as they came over the hill, some moonlight shined down and revealed a terrifying sight. The figure was dressed in black, riding a black horse, and his head was missing from his shoulders. Instead, it rode on the pommel of the saddle, and as soon as Ichabod saw this, he gave Gunpowder a few good kicks, and they took off down the road. They raced across the countryside, but the Headless Horseman was never far behind. At one point, Ichabod even loses his saddle and had to hold onto Gunpowder for dear life. As the terrified teacher feels the hot breath of the horseman's steed on his neck, he thinks his life is over, but up ahead, he sees the exact bridge Brom Bones said he crossed when the horseman disappeared. Ichabod and Gunpowder race forward, and before long, they've made it to the other side of the bridge in one piece. At this moment, Ichabod looked back to see if the pursuer had indeed vanished, but what he saw instead was the horseman's head hurtling right towards his face. It collided directly with his head, sent him flying off the horse and tumbling into the dust as Gunpowder and the horseman sprinted past him into the dark of night. The next day, Ichabod mysteriously didn't show up for any of his commitments. He missed breakfast, dinner, and school the following week. An investigation was started, and residents found his trampled saddle, as well as his trampled hat, next to a smashed pumpkin on the side of the road. But those were the only clues they had. Since Crane was a bachelor and didn't owe anyone money, they all just moved on and chalked his disappearance up to the Headless Horseman. From that point forward, the Sleepy Hollow citizens considered that bridge haunted and avoided it whenever possible. Eventually, a new path had to be made so people could still cross the brook. No one replaced Ichabod as the school teacher either, so the school was abandoned and, to no surprise, was said to be haunted by his ghost. Sometime later, Brom Bones and Katrina got married, and the narrator exclaims that whenever someone brought up Ichabod or the mysterious smashed pumpkin, he would look exceedingly knowing and even sometimes laugh. I wonder if Ichabod was killed by a ghost coming back from the dead in search of his missing head, or the jealous, hyper-aggressive stunt rider who just so happened to be competing for the same woman. Well, it turns out it might be neither. Despite the claims of Sleepy Hollow's residents, one farmer visiting from New York brought information that Crane was still alive, had moved somewhere else, continued teaching while studying law, turned politician, and eventually joined the 10-pound court, whatever that is. So despite that terrifying series of events and unsubstantiated rumors, Ichabod might have ended up with a happy ending after all.
That was a pretty wild story, right? And for once, Disney's adaptation honored it pretty accurately. But as Isaac said, Washington Irving was inspired by the ghost stories he heard as a child, so Where did those come from? Well, like most of the stories we cover here, the Headless Horseman can be traced back across multiple countries, including Ireland, Scotland, Germany, and Scandinavia. For example, in Ireland and Scotland, he's referred to as the Dullahan, and similar to Irving's version, he also rides at night and wears black. But unlike Irving's horseman, this one isn't looking for his head. He keeps it on the pommel of his saddle, and it actually glows so he can use it as a lantern. Disgusting and practical. He'd only come out at night to avoid being seen, but if you did happen to catch a glance, he would throw a bucket of blood right in your face. The Dullahan is said to be the Celtic equivalent of death, in that his presence equates to the death of an individual, and he's also what's called a solitary fairy. Unlike the fairies we're accustomed to hearing about, like Tinkerbell and the Sleeping Beauty trio, solitary fairies, like leprechauns and banshees, prefer to remain hidden and are characterized by an unpleasant disposition. In addition to riding his horse, he could be seen just as often driving his death coach, a carriage pulled by 6 black horses which also happen to be headless. I don't think it gets more scary than that. Imagine riding alone down the country road and you see the death coach creeping up in your peripheral. Terrifying.
Funnily enough, not every Headless Horseman has as bad of intentions as the last few, though it's hard to imagine a Headless Horseman with good intentions. Another Irishman named Thomas Crofton Croker wrote a short story about the horseman and a character named Charley Chulainn, who seems like a nice guy. When Charley is riding across the countryside on a rainy night, he comes across the ghostly figure, but instead of a dark horse, this time it's a white one. Charley is scared, but tries to be polite to the ghost, who decided to quietly ride by his side. At first, this doesn't go so well. Charley compliments the horseman's ride, and he responds, "You may say that with your own ugly mouth." This is ironically coming from the guy whose head is literally rotting under his arm. Listen to this description. It looked like a large cream cheese hung round with black puddings. No speck of color enlivened the ashy paleness of the depressed features. The skin lay stretched over the unearthly surface, almost like the parchment head of a drum. 2 fiery eyes of prodigious circumference with a strange and irregular motion flashed like meteors upon Charley, and a huge mouth reached from either extremity of 2 ears, which peeped forth from under a profusion of matted locks of lustreless blackness. The horseman's attitude suddenly changes when Charley asks if he's ever raced across the countryside. In response, he asks Charley to race him. At first, Charley is intimidated, and who can blame him? But ultimately, he accepts the challenge, because when a guy with no head tells you to do something, you do it. He ends up losing the race, but the horseman compliments the man's bravery and expresses his gratitude, as no one had the courage to race him since he and his horse broke their necks at the bottom of the nearby river 100 years before. In the end, he tells Charley that as long as he remains brave, he'll be there to help him when he needs it.
So as you can see, there's some real diversity in the Headless Ghost community. There's some that want to kill you and others that just want to test your mettle. It makes you wonder what nearly headless Nick would have been like if his head was totally chopped off. There's even a German version of the story where the horseman is even nicer than that. One day, a woman who's picking acorns hears the blow of a war horn and looks up to see a headless rider dressed in gray speeding past. The next day, she goes back to the same spot, and the rider actually approaches her and asks, "Did no one try to punish you for stealing those acorns?" The woman responds that no. While she does understand that stealing is wrong, the forest animals know that she's poor and have mercy on her. So every night, she prays to God for forgiveness. The rider says that's a wise thing to do. As legend says, anyone who's guilty of a crime and escapes punishment while here on Earth is destined to spend eternity as a headless spirit. He then reveals that he lived 130 years earlier and was quite the bastard, so this is his punishment. It's so interesting to me that the same character can be used in stories all around the world when communication was so limited, and all the different lessons that character can be used to teach. Sure, in the more modern versions, there wasn't much of a point outside of scaring the reader. The rider was just a soldier who had his head blown off, and that was that. But when you go to the story's roots, they all seem to have morals. They promote bravery, honesty, and having the humility to ask for forgiveness when you know you're wrong. It's really kind of funny that it started out like that and evolved into a story about a love triangle between 3 characters that aren't even that good of people. And with that, today's episode of Messed Up Origins comes to a close. Thank you all so much for watching, and thank you to Isaac for all your help.
Glad I could help out today, John. It was a lot of fun being able to discuss Sleepy Hollow and Hocus Pocus over on my channel, WotsoVideos.
I can't stress enough how great it's been working together, and if you guys are interested in our video about Hocus Pocus, I got a link to it at the end of this video and down below. Now, as always, I want to hear your thoughts on today's episode. What'd you think of the Headless Horseman origins? Let me know in the comments. Also, don't forget to smash smash that like button so we can reach our weekly goal of 10,000 likes. You guys have knocked it out of the park for 3 episodes in a row. Can you make it 4? And of course, subscribe and ring that bell to be notified about new messed up content coming to your sub box every week. If you want to stay updated on Messed Up Origins news, what projects I'm working on next, or if you just want to say what's up, I got the links to my social medias down below, as well as Isaac, so if you want to tell him how much you enjoyed his presence in this episode, feel free. Thank you all again for watching. I'll be seeing you very soon. Until next time, my name is John Solo, and remember, John shot first.